This is Heather McDonald. Welcome to the Break It Down show.
Welcome indeed. Yes, Heather. By the way, I just got back from vacation, so everybody's like, "Hey, wait, Pete put up a show," um,
I
because
hope
we
you
get
were
to.
reading. I hope you were reading my book on the vacation, Pete.
I
It's
actually
a
was
great.
reading
It's a great
another book.
beach book.
I read your book a couple, over a month ago, but I am reading another book. I was reading that on vacation. Um, here's the thing about all of these social issues, and I've got a little bit of social chops too. I've got some peer-reviewed articles, and these problems that we try to take on. These are ancient problems. These are human problems, and we can never seem to master some of them. And it makes me wonder if we ever will, and we disagree so vehemently and so emotionally. So the topics that you get into, we need to have these conversations, but even just talking about the discussions of these things, and the coded wording and how you say things, and it all gets in the way of the actual conversation. What is the conversation? Like, if we could just strip away all of the mores and all of the memes and all of the other things, and I mean memes like in the classic sense, and I guess memes in the modern sense. What is it that we're trying to figure out right now?
Well, yeah, I would say that this is not so ancient a discourse because I think we're in a really unprecedented moment of a Western civilization trying to cancel itself based on a phony narrative about ubiquitous and endemic systemic racism. I mean, I guess you could define things at an extremely broad level so that everything looks like everything else. But I've never seen anything like this, where you have the heads of science organizations and mathematics associations and medical schools declaring that science and medicine is racist because meritocratic standards have a disparate impact on Black medical students or Black doctors, or the heads of classical music organizations, art museums saying that Western music and Western art is somehow pervaded by systemic racism. This is a very weird thing where you have the leaders and the guardians of particular traditions that represent some of the highest and most sublime thinking of human beings turning on the traditions that it is their privilege to curate. So, I guess you could say what's universal about this? I guess it's group conflict, but the self-annihilation of elite whites, I think, is actually without precedent.
Is it not just in group, out group stuff, though? I mean, is it not like the constant tumult of who is in, who is out, who needs to be in, who needs to be out? I mean, is it not just a subset of that?
Well, when has an in-group decided that it should be out
I
and
don't know.
and decided that, I mean, in a sense, the college presidents like Christopher Eisgruber at Princeton and Peter Salovey at Yale, who go around virtue signaling and proclaiming that they preside over racist institutions, something that is a complete lie. I
Okay.
can guarantee you, Pete, Princeton and Yale and every other selective college is twisting itself into knots to admit as many Black students as possible, to hire as many Black faculty as possible, to promote them. The faculty are open-armed, welcoming, tolerant. They are not racist institutions. Nevertheless, you get Eisgruber and Salovey and head of Amherst and Middlebury and you name it, saying, "Oh, woe is me! Everybody's so racist around me." In fact, they are the in-group. They do not voluntarily step down. So there is that degree of in-group trying to protect itself. But nevertheless, we don't see this happening in other cultures. I don't see Africa apologizing and seeking reparations from itself for its involvement in the slave trade. I don't see China or Japan apologizing for their hatred of foreigners, for their xenophobia, for their massacres, for their brutality. I don't see African chiefs in Nigeria apologizing for the kingdom of Dahomey with its history of brutality and enslavement. Only the West is engaged in this bizarre self-flagellation of a culture that has given prosperity and freedom from disease and premature childbirth mortality rates to the entire planet.
There's a lot you just said there, and you really landed on something great. In my baseball commentary side of my life, people will say, "Oh, you took Babe Ruth and you brought him in the modern time. He wouldn't be any good." I'm like, if Babe Ruth was born in 1895, the most common thing for a kid between 18 and 0 and 18, 25% of those kids died. Almost all of them had some kind of life-threatening fever. They all, for sure, their brothers and sisters, they had someone dead in their life. Life expectancy was somewhere near 48 if you were born in 1895. Nobody wore a helmet when they played baseball. I mean, his life was way, way harder, right? And we've overcome so many things in the last, I don't know, 150 years, right? The discovery and harnessing of what I would call just the modern miracle of oil. I mean, it's amazing all the things that we get out of that. Our ability to refine all kinds of things and find uses for cows, that so that a cow, basically, once a cow is harvested, almost every single piece of it is used over and over and over and over again, right? So we have figured a lot of these things out, and there are less people in poverty than ever around the whole entire world. It is strange that we are so hard on ourselves, and I
Well,
don't know
look
why
at
is that.
your viewers can see what's behind me. They can see your headphones, every single substance. I mean, I sort of am getting impressed by materials engineering. Like this formica, whatever my desk is, everything in our constructed environment was created by scientists, by tinkerers that
Yeah,
have given us not just the amazing miracle of turning on electricity with a flick of a switch, but clean air, clean water, clean milk, as you say, child death in childbirth for the mothers and for the children was
yeah.
absolutely the fate of humanity. We have gone beyond that. Most diseases that were mowing down children, those are gone. But my God, how can we not be down on our knees every single day at this conquest of penury? And I would say, yes, I mean, there's still terrible famines in third world countries. But basically, in the United States, the only real poverty is parental poverty, that you don't have two married parents. That's the big class and divide that we've got.
Hmm.
But everybody in America today is extraordinarily wealthy compared to what the standard of living was for monarchs for centuries. The resources that kids in West Harlem or East Harlem can command make anything that Louis the 14th, the Sun King, could command just pale in comparison. These kids we're supposed to believe, according to Chicago Mayor Brandon Johnson, that they're going out in these flash mobs assaulting people on Chicago's Magnificent Mile in downtown Chicago. Well, it's all driven by lack of opportunity, and they're so poor that makes them go and just bash people over the head. Well, you know what? The police's greatest friend is social media, because all of these kids have smartphones, and if they're in gangs, they're putting pictures of themselves on the web, flashing gang signs with their drugs and their guns. Any kid that has a smartphone is not poor. I'm sorry. And yet we're supposed to excuse the total breakdown of personal responsibility that is going on in the families that are not socializing these kids as the result of poverty. Sorry, that's preposterous.
You said a lot there too. The willful allowance of, look, young kids are supposed to challenge authority, and they're supposed to do dumb things like steal and all that kind of stuff, right? But to
Really?
codify it into
Okay,
law, well, no, they're supposed to, I'm not just saying just to allow it. They're supposed to challenge, right? And then there's supposed to be a pushback from society that says, hey, that's not how society operates, right? So what point do they learn this lesson? At what point do we put the structure around them to say, you need to be in school, you need to have consequences for your action, you need to have some delayed gratification, all of these things, so you can improve yourself and be part of this wonderful thing that we've built.
yeah, I mean, I would say that the kids are supposed to challenge authority is really a product of the 60s, maybe the 1950s, where you started having the glorification of juvenile delinquency and the social excuses for it, that, oh, the Officer Krupke, well, of course I'm a juvenile delinquent. I had a bad upbringing and whatnot, but I don't think that was necessarily uh, the expectation. It certainly is now, Pete. You're absolutely right. I mean, I remember in the 90s these nauseating stories in the New York Times from college professors saying, "Where's all the student protesters?" You know, as if that's their main role to be in college. No, to be in college, you should be down on your knees in gratitude at the fact that you can read every book that's ever been written, and you're there to absorb knowledge. You're not there to virtue signal and profess to have the answer to problems that you know nothing about.
Oh boy.
Students, adolescents are rank idiots.
Yeah.
They're narcissists, they're self-involved, they believe they're the first people in the human history to have a sense of injustice, whether it's racial or social. They should not be listened to. Every so often they get it right. They were right with regards to Tiananmen Square, but by and large they get it wrong. And you know, if you want to see a different world, look at Kitty in Anna Karenina by Tolstoy. This was a girl who was heartbroken by a Russian nobleman, Vronsky, and her parents decided she was so just sort of wasting away in sorrow at the fact that she had a crush on this guy and he put her off. They took her to a spa, one of the usual 19th century fake remedies. Will take you to a sanatorium and that'll make all your ills go away. And so she and her mother, two Russians at a spa in Germany, she spotted another Russian girl about her age. She had to ask permission from her mother to even talk to this girl. It was just assumed that everything was channeled through the authority of the mother. And Kitty was, you know, a late teenager, if not in her early 20s. Our sense of juvenile power, adolescent power, is very new, and it's partly a result of the success of capitalism, where for the first time in human history in the 1950s, you had teenagers with spending power, an independent market that corporations could start marketing to. That was not a good thing for the fate of our culture and standards of taste and art, I can tell you that. But you know, it began the breakdown of parental authority, which we see now, certainly with this amazing idea that parents shouldn't be informed if their child in school, a fifth grader, is going around changing his sex.
Yeah. Yeah. It's interesting, the removal of the parent from that. Look, it's not common, right? But when it happens, it's appalling. When you see the district hiding something from the parent because the parent isn't good enough, can't act appropriately. It's their kid. It's their responsibility. Now, maybe that parent needs to rise to the responsibility, but that is the parent's job, right? And if we're not going to license parents before they can have kids, then this is the world we live in, right? Like
Yeah.
and I'm not suggesting that we should license parents, but having a kid requires us all to learn how to become good parents, and hopefully we become better parents as we get older.
Yeah, here in Irvine, the Irvine Company, which is this massive real estate developer that practically owns the entirety of the city of Irvine, in their wisdom during the COVID year, where I live, there's a lot of students ordinarily that would be attending UC, University of California at Irvine, but they lost their student tenants. And so they moved in underneath me, this white trash couple that are meth involved, fentanyl involved, and they instantiate every single stereotype about white trash. I mean, nobody in their ambit has any teeth. They're all tatted up and they're screaming and whatnot. And I look at these people and wonder, like, what parents spawned you? What sort of breakdown in family parental involvement led to your dysfunctional state that is so against any sense of nobility or beauty? It's very depressing. And I think American parents have lost an understanding of the preciousness of childhood and the innocence that needs to be preserved. I don't know, what is turning out, just these battalions of people that just seem to have no purpose in life. The drug addiction, among Americans is much, much higher than in other Western countries. Something is broken here, and I think part of it is what I write about in this book, which is the constant denigration of Western civilization, and I'm talking about mostly on racial grounds. But that message gets across, and it gives children nothing to believe in and nothing to aspire to, and and it's certainly, I mean, for white males, heterosexual white males are absolute pariahs now. They're at the bottom of the heap. They're not, they're the last to be admitted to medical schools, the last to be admitted to law schools. They have to be 3 times as good as anybody else. It's the exact opposite of the Black Lives Matter narrative. And so that has got to also affect white male self-conception.
Yeah, it's an interesting thing. I live in California as well, and I think it must be so hard to govern this state with all of the different pockets and people and well-moneyed political blocs, that can fight different things. I don't know. Can you even govern a state as complex as California without? I mean, all the different things you have to consider, and all of the money that they all can fight with and use lawfare or whatever you want to call every term. It seems it's just unmanageable. And so you have these open wounds, homelessness, for example. We can't seem to resolve it.
Well, I mean, I'm going to just be biased here and favor my own policy or moral solutions, and I realize the other side would say just the opposite, but I would say, of course, it's governable. You stop bashing bourgeois norms of personal responsibility, deferred gratification, impulse control. You, as a policymaker, as a political leader, you put the interests of the hardworking, the well-behaved, the social ahead of those of the antisocial, the dysfunctional, the criminal. Right now, we have the great inversion where it is the interests of the antisocial, the dysfunctional, the vagrants, the criminals that are the primary focus of policymakers, and everybody else who's going to work every day, and the business owners that have to clean up the feces and the hypodermic needles in front of their porches, and the employees who have to pick their way through the zoned out bodies. They're just viewed as ATM machines. So yes, I would say that you can govern still. We did it before we had the celebration of multiculturalism. I mean, California in the 50s and 60s and into the 70s was extremely well run. Los Angeles was not a hellhole. It breaks my heart to go back there now. The squalor, the graffiti everywhere, the trash, it didn't look like that, and it doesn't have to look like that. It will look like that when you simply throw up your hands and say, we as white people have no right to expect personal responsibility from any other group or from certain favored whites in our group. But the type of multicultural excuse making, above all when it comes to race, and unwinding the criminal justice system, which is all to avoid disparate impact, which is what my book is about.
Yeah.
That is a recipe for anarchy.
Getting into your book a little bit, one of the things we seem to struggle with here when it comes to race is, well, first off, it's emotionally charged. So as soon as you get into it, people start to lather up, and we can't even have the conversation because it's just so charged. But race is really a crappy construct to break people down. It's are you French? Are you Romanian? Are you an Egyptian? All white. Right? I mean, that's like everybody's a white person. What's black? When are you black? When are you black enough? All these things, it's just, who knows? And it's someone else's job to tell me what I am or what I am not or what I believe. That all these things deny the thing that makes America great, is that we are individuals, that you can do what you want to do. And that for the most part, most people I meet, and I meet a lot of people, like, I don't have a problem with anybody. I have a problem with people who have a problem with me and me doing my own thing, right? And that's what most people have a problem with, is like, don't tell me I'm a bad person. Don't limit my ability to do what I need to do. most everybody I run across, there are exceptions, but they're pretty happy to let people do what they need to do and to be left alone if all things are going to be equal, which for most people they are.
Well, I agree. I think Americans are absolutely hungry to be post-racial. And, Biden goes around saying that white supremacy is the biggest problem in this country and that there's this enduring stain of racism on white American soul that will never really be purged. And I just think that's completely wrong. He's obviously referring to Republicans, and I will just notice that white Republicans have had one love affair after another with black politicians, whether it's Condoleezza Rice or Colin Powell or Alan Keyes or Alan West or Burgess Owens. I mean, it just goes on and on. And what matters to them is, do you share my values? Do you have the same attitudes towards America? They don't give a damn about race. But obviously, for black race hustlers, it is absolutely essential to hold on to the essential nature of racial identity at the same time that they are maintaining what is a scientifically illiterate position, which is that race does not exist as a genetic category. In fact, it does. So they want to have it both ways, that race is socially constructed. That's wrong scientifically. And if you don't see my race, you don't see me. Don't you ever, dare to be colorblind, because that would deny me my humanity. Well, here's what it denies you. It denies you your ability to put everybody else under your thumb and to play the race hustle and get hired because of the color of your skin, not because of your competence. And that's what's going on throughout the science fields, as I say, in medicine, in law, at universities. It is happening everywhere. And we are, and on the federal bench, I mean, you have Biden putting people on the bench for no other reason that they're black and female. We are absolutely putting our future progress and our safety at risk with this crusade that holds that any meritocratic colorblind standard that has a disparate impact on blacks is per se racist.
My basic stance. Look, I was born in '70, so you kind of tell the era that I grew up in. It's been ever changing, but is I just believe in people. Here in America, you get a chance to prove yourself, and if you work hard, someone's going to recognize that, and they're going to reach out and they're going to give you a hand. And maybe that doesn't work, but as long as you keep after it, in most cases, more often than probably anywhere else, you can do all right. You can educate yourself, you can get educated. You may not want to join the military, but if you do, they'll buy a college education for you. It's pretty crazy. And there's a lot of places that will do that when you don't even have to join the military. And for the most part, they don't care what color you are. So we do get hung up on this stuff. And when I say, like, hey, I believe in people, right? It's almost like people aren't sure what to do with that. Like, I don't care what your ethnicity is. I just care that you believe in you. How can I help? What can I do to help you? And if there's nothing I can do, then I'm just going to believe in you. I'm going to check in on you. That's what I have. And that's how I'm part of the community. And for whatever reason, that often meets with some serious, I wouldn't say disgust, but rebut. They don't like it. I believe in people, regardless of what color of skin they are, what socioeconomic status they are. If there's something that I can do to help somebody and I have that availability to help them, and I'm a man of modest means. I don't have a lot of stuff, but if I can help someone, if I can lift them up in some way, put them on the show, whatever it is, I do it. I don't look at what color they are. I just look at the fact that, hey, here's someone I can help out in my community. I'm going to do it.
Yeah. Well, I agree. And, there's a debate in conservative circles now about whether the economy has now made it impossible to have any kind of upward mobility. There's a group of thinkers that are pushing back against what is they would portray as the mindless celebration of free market capitalism. They say that doesn't take into account externalities. We've given too much power to businesses. Workers are being oppressed. And we should have like industrial policy, and the government should pick winners and losers and protect people from competition. I'm somewhat skeptical about that, and I actually am with you, Pete, in that I do think that there is still extraordinary opportunity in this country if people have good work habits.
Right.
If they are responsible. I reviewed a book years ago. I think it was out in the 1990s, maybe the early 2000s. I can't remember, called No Shame in My Game. And it was by a liberal sociologist who did a study of fast food workers at a particular unnamed chain, but one assumes it was Burger King, probably McDonald's. And her point was, yes, you start out at the minimum wage, but these fast food enterprises are promotion machines. They are desperate to get people from within the ranks and promote you, and they will train you, they will push you up. If you stay, if you're reliable, if you show up and you have a good work record, you will go up the ladder. And instead, we have the elites that sneer at fast food jobs or minimum wage jobs and do not allow for the fact that all work is noble. But again, I do believe that if you are a worker that is reliable, that is so unusual today that you will be able to develop a stable life. And back in the 90s, an advisor to Bill Clinton, president, named William Galston, was one of several voices that talked about what's called the success sequence, which is, here's how you avoid being poor. You graduate from high school, you work full time, and you put off having children until you're married. Anybody who does that, and you can be working full time at a minimum wage job, you have a 75% chance of being middle class. And that sort of message that you have control over your destiny by the choices you make is just not one that is embraced by our elites that are going around telling people to think of themselves as victims. And to further buttress your point about, is America still the land of opportunity? I think the border crisis is an absolute abomination. It is an instantiation of the Great Replacement theory. We have to get control over it. Nevertheless, one has to note that the direction of migration in the world is always from third world people of color countries into America. They all want to come here. The ACLU goes around telling us that this is a racist country, white supremacy, at the same time that it's insisting that every last third world person should be able to come into the country without any immigration checks or limits. So which one is it, ACLU? Is this a systemically oppressive place for people of color, or is it a place that has an obligation to take in every third world person because we offer so many opportunities? And obviously people are voting with their feet.
When people come here, we believe that they're taking jobs that we just don't want to do, right? And so what jobs do people who are young want to do? And we do have the sense that kids don't want to be baggers in grocery stores anymore. But there's a lot of young people that have a car and they're delivering groceries and they're more entrepreneurial and they want to work on their own terms. And so we do see a lot of that, and the job market has changed. How much of this are you and your peers missing because you're not as hip and with it, in terms of technology and the gig economy and that kind of thing? Is there any truth in there at all?
Well, what's the question? Why?
The question is like when we think about young people who aren't willing to work and not being reliable, maybe a lot of them are just bleeding out and they're doing things like Uber or delivering groceries in their car, or they're walking dogs on an app. And so they're hard to see in terms of the job data because they're not working at McDonald's or Burger King. And then those are jobs that are filled by people who are immigrating here illegally or otherwise. So maybe those people are out there working. Maybe they are doing things. Maybe they're making money playing video games online. That's a viable job these days, hard to track. So is some of that willingness to work maybe invisible to modern research techniques?
Well, I don't know. I can't answer that. It's nothing I've looked into. I will say that I've talked to employers, during the 1990s in New York City with Mayor Rudolph Giuliani, when he was still a sane person. That was the big era of welfare reform. Right. And the idea that if you're going to receive welfare, you should actually give something back to taxpayers and work, get a job or do workfare. And employers were pretty much at wit's end because it was so hard to find reliable workers. So I don't know about younger people working. There are obviously people, young kids that have been raised by families that have given them very good bourgeois values, and are told you are gonna, if you want to have extra spending money, you're gonna have to work for it. So that's out there. But I would say generally, I think there is a problem with a large sector of the labor group, and again, it's another interesting debate within conservative circles of, do you tell people to pull up their bootstraps and stop whining and just get a job, any job, or do you say, well, the structural economy is hurting them? And it can be noticed that when Black sociologists like William Julius Wilson said, well, a lot of the Black underclass problems are because of deindustrialization and jobs leaving, a lot of white conservatives said, well, no, it really is more family breakdown and a cultural issue. It's not that we are all determined by the economy. But now, now that the white underclass is sort of falling into similar habits, you have a more accepted language about an economic determinism there. And I'm frankly not persuaded much in either case. I still think, again, that individuals have the capacity to become valuable workers through their own personal choices of respecting authority, obeying rules, being reliable, and that will help you get forward in life.
One of the things that's in your book, you talk about the race and admissions and these aspects. Are we seeing the high end, the apex of a pendulum swing, and then we're going to go back the other direction? Obviously, we have these Supreme Court cases that have come through and changed that aspect of it. And look, maybe the institutions will find creative ways to get around it, but you got all these great Asian kids from Irvine. They're like, I'd like to go to Harvard, and you guys are discriminating against me, right? So we've worked on changing that. And here comes our friend Will Reilly. So have we seen the pendulum go all the way up to the other side? And it's not any tastier when it goes the other way. So if not, where is the pendulum at? Where is the pendulum at in terms of, can this get any worse, or have we seen the worst of it?
Well, I'm a pessimist, so I believe things can always get worse. And I still am getting amazing announcements that my doctor friends are sending me, declaring medicine racist. And, we have to, the National Science Foundation, NIH, continues to say that one's sex or race are the primary determinants of getting research grants. The colleges are still adding new diversity bureaucrats like crazy. It's just amazing. So I think it's going to take, the Supreme Court decision was just one baby step in the right direction. And you're absolutely right, Pete. There's going to be massive resistance to this. We already have the available mechanism of so-called holistic admissions that colleges like in California that are facing a supposed ban on racial preferences have been using to import race. And just as Robert said, well, come and get it. You can talk about race in your admissions essay and how this has been such a trauma for you. And I think colleges, we've already seen Harvard and others saying, yeah, that's what we're going to start doing. So it's going to be a while. And I think it's going to, what I keep waiting to see happen is the leaders of institutions stopping this perverse discourse that says that math and science and medicine and the law are all racist if any standards within them have disparate impact. Instead, they're continuing to lodge this completely specious accusation against their own institutions. The cowardice and the conformity is utterly nauseating.
Welcome to the show, Will.
Yeah, glad to be here. Good to see you, Heather. Good to see you, Pete. Just got out of class. It's a long day, but very happy to be here. What's going on, guys?
Well, we just have sort of been kind of banging around the topic, the book and, the standard thing with these social problems. And, we see these things, and you were on Twitter the other day talking about a number of these things, but just the elimination of more and more testing from college students. And this is back to the pendulum question. If the administrators do add more and more and more fat to the traditional institutions, and if the bar is, we'll just be nice and say, change to a different event, and it's easier for people to get into, great, more people are going to college, good job. But at some point, it just becomes a farce, and people will not go to the farcical institution. They will go do things like become pipe fitters and open up their own pipe fitting business or welding or whatever it's going to be. People think it's bad to be a ditch digger. The last ditch digger I met face to face was a multimillionaire, lived in Las Vegas and owned bobcats, and that guy made all kinds of money. So we can look down on certain jobs, but the fact is I can go into debt for $250,000, or I can go buy a bunch of bobcats, start taking down contracts, and make $1 million.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot of that's more in kind of the commentary vein, but I think there's a definite point there. I also think Heather made a really 2 points as we kind of led into this. The first is that obviously right now, well, actually, I think the first point gets into something that Richard Hanania, for example, said in a recent book, which is that the roots of what we call wokeness are often seen as being very theoretical. And people argue about, obscure Brazilian Marxist philosophers and so on. A lot of this is actually related to major institutions within our society, like bureaucratic interpretations of civil rights law and so on down the line. So the question of how to get rid of a lot of this, I think all of us have been business executives, but if you're in a corporate enterprise where 4% of the employees have been hired as part of some affirmative action outreach plan or directly into the Department of Diversity, Equity, and et cetera, there's an enterprise base there. Like, you have to do something to get rid of that. You can't just say we're beating wokeness. Like, as social trends change, the people in that role might be quiet for a little bit. Like, our good friend Ibram Kendi's anti-racist center at Boston University laid off 10 of its staff of, I think, 55, I just read. But when the tides shift back again, there's still going to be an anti-racism center at Boston University. So in terms of a lot of this stuff, like, do colleges have institutional plans of reverse racial discrimination that are followed with different degrees of aggression in different political climates? The ultimate solution to that would be something like a Supreme Court decision or a law that says that you can't discriminate based on race. I think that's an extremely good point that people don't make often enough. When you say we need to make the schools less woke, that can't just mean changing the books that teachers assign in a particular session of classes. It also has to mean, to some extent, determining who the teachers are going forward, so on down the line. Yeah, and I mean, the last comment on this in terms of the other note, the Supreme Court, to a large extent, struck down affirmative action in higher ed. I will tell you, people are panicking. I mean, like, they definitely think that a move was made.
Right.
So you progress incrementally. Like, obviously, if you oppose affirmative action, not having affirmative action is better than having affirmative action. The question is just, what does that mean? Could they immediately switch to something that's not covered by law at all, such as class or trauma-based diversity forward programs? And that's what they basically said, that you can't openly cite race as a reason you should be admitted into higher ed, but you can say, for example, that you've been traumatized by the experience of being Black in this white supremacist society. Right. I will say, for what I've heard about, UK, Illinois, the schools that I interact with, that people are beginning to do this. So we will see.
Yeah. No, I think it's naive to think that there's not going to be massive disobedience of this, and they've got many, many existing tools for doing so. About 6-7 years ago, there was the concept of toxic racism, that being Black was somehow injurious to Blacks' health because they're just surrounded by such a toxic environment of white supremacy. And that's going to start showing up in admissions essays. So there's plenty of ways to redo this. But as far as your point, Pete, about, well, when are people going to realize that it's more satisfying than getting some stupid marketing degree? I mean, the university complex now is just an absolute abomination. It's filled with these fake disciplines, marketing. That's not what you go to college for. You go to college, in my view, and this, I guess, could be deemed elitist, but it is really to learn to get the transmission of the Western civilization. If you want to go to learn marketing, just start working in a corporation. But college should be about great books, exposing students to some of the greatest minds in human history. And instead, they're just these fake degrees. The bureaucracy is out of control. It's not just the diversity bureaucracy, but the whole student services bureaucracy is largely because we keep expanding the student body to students have no business being in college. And we have this just obsession with thinking that, as you say, you only have the right to self-respect if you've got a college degree. That's absurd. Again, males are being sidelined, but they should be encouraged to build upon their, on average, greater interest in how things work, in machines, and taking things apart, putting them back together again, having mastery of systems. And we should never, I think that some of the greatest jobs that I'm most grateful for is sanitation workers, the people in the New York City subways that are cleaning. They should have the most self-respect of anybody because civilization depends on them. But so we've got to stop this idea that college is the absolute key to a fulfilling life, because it's mostly just a drain. And it makes me sick to my stomach that colleges are held harmless. When people complain about, oh, high tuition, we need to have more federal grants, and then we have to have forgiveness of federal grants. And the Biden administration has never said to colleges, well, how about you lower your tuition? How about you get rid of 90% of your bureaucrats so that the tuitions are lower and students don't have to take out this massive amount of debt? But we all treat tuitions as these naturally occurring phenomena that nobody has any control of. And the colleges just sort of lie low and expect the federal government to bail them out.
Yeah, my favorite example is Harvard, who has, I think it's depending on where you read, but let's just say it's a $75 billion endowment. Why does anybody in Massachusetts pay anything for school? Just go lean on those guys and go, just use the interest and let us know when you run out of interest money, and can go do some fundraising. Seriously, stop with all this stuff. It's ridiculous.
Yeah.
An upper mid-level institution like my own University of Illinois, I think we're at $5 or $6 billion right now. They contacted me with a fundraising letter the other day, and there's an element of humor to it. I'm doing quite well, but I'm not worth any. Millions would be hard to get to. It's these sort of hedge funds with buildings attached have. Yeah. Begin playing an increasingly bizarre and more arrogant role in American society. I think more and more people are starting to point that out. And again, I will say Heather does a great job with this. I think we're starting to see other people doing this a little bit. But the issues here are institutional. There's an entire book, The Fall of the Faculty, that talks about how academic governance was taken away from university professors. For example, we used to do 2 hours of student advising a week. I was a track man 50 pounds ago. You might be a coach for at least the JV level, something like that. And essentially, corporate executives were hired as college presidents, and they began to hire the kind of people they were used to. Yeah. So, when you talk about student service, we have a marketing department, and KSU is just, again, a mid-sized college. You have student services, Greek life, people live in fraternity houses. There are 2 or 3 in every building. Coaches, et cetera. I could go on for a while about this. But again, how do you remove those actual organizations that have physical plan? Now, what do you do about the athletic building? There's a question if you want to change this system.
Yeah, and I would just say, among those bureaucrats, the student services, you've got now this whole thing of first generation students that they need, special help. Well, we had the World War II Pell Grants, or the getting veterans into schools. They were first generation as well, and they didn't need all this hand-holding because they were admitted based on their qualifications. A vast proportion of the student services bureaucracies, because we insist on admitting students who are not college ready. partly because of the usual identity issues, and partly just to get warm seats on those classrooms, so that they can continue, bringing in state tuition funding and whatnot. But I do hope that people become more cynical, but I'm not sure. I mean, I still see a lot of, let's face it, those of us with college degrees, we definitely have sort of a ranking. I confess I'm guilty myself of, who went to what college, and that's, it's sort of our form of Chinese or Brahmin, status assignment. And certainly for the upper class, it's an absolute obsession.
Yeah, that is a real thing. I haven't, not to brag or anything, because who the fuck cares? It was in the 1900s, but I got a master's degree in organizational management, and it's the University of Phoenix, and people are instantly going to turn their nose up at that. But I got it at Fort Huachuca, and I learned project management from a guy who did project management every day. I sat in front of this guy, and some of my peers were project managers, and we did this form of learning that was fantastic. I learned stats from a statistician who did that every day, and he taught me, it's like, you're not going to be a statistician. You need to understand how to put me to work. And I had this fantastic degree. But you were right. If I say University of Phoenix, I have to explain this whole thing where I would put my degree up against anybody's, because I talked to people who did the job and taught me how they did it at the master's level. And I read all the books, and the books, you go get Harvard's books, and then you have the practitioner teach you. I think that's a pretty good degree. But you're right. University of Phoenix is code word for garbage. And here it is. And plus, it was almost 25 years ago. Who even cares, right? Like, look at what I've done since then. That doesn't define who I am. But you're right. It does matter to some people.
It's actually amusingly situational too. Like, I mentioned I went to Illinois for law school. Like, most of my friends went to one of the large Midwestern Big Ten, like Northwestern, Michigan. A lot of them went to the University of Chicago, and it's almost a tradition among us not to take the Ivy League seriously. I'm sure the same thing's true in reverse, but like, many of the Ivy League people I've met, because the level of legacy and affirmative action programming there were just complete twits, like stereotypical PG Roadhouse stuff. So like, there are different layers within which people make fun of each other about college background. And the reason for that, I think, is pretty simple. Like, America doesn't have a nobility.
Right.
So you have to figure out how to be pretentious. Like, what is it? Is it your college degree? People now are, the joke is dinner parties, all these weird new brands of fitness. Like, I'm a vegan CrossFitter. I'm clearly not, but just like, people want to find ways to feel superior to other people. In reality, the actual SAT difference between like Brown and Northwestern might not exist, but it's another way to illustrate that you did thing X. And like, last very quick line, the idea that both you guys have floated about just intelligent people are going to start going to non-traditional colleges, or just like work as woodworkers or sanitation managers or something, that's happened a lot under incompetent nobilities. There are entire books about like the yeoman or the poor knight, where people are just like, the leaders are idiots. I'm going to take my horse and get as far from the capital as I can, and I'm going to grow fruit. That's not ideal, because the smartest people aren't your leaders, however.
Well, and to pick up on something you said earlier, Will, about, if we want to change the college ambience and what it stands for and is able to transmit to students, you need to change the people in it that are the teachers. And that's a real tough nut to crack, because right now, if you want to study something traditional and be able to be in a position to pass on the Western inheritance, you're not going to get into graduate school, and you're not going to be able to get a job. And certainly, if you add to that, that, let's say you want to study Renaissance literature or 19th century romantic novels, or Mozart, the Habsburg Empire, or early Japan, and you're a heterosexual white male, it's all over for you. So you've got sort of a chicken and egg problem, where you have faculties now that are so dominated by identity politics, and they're not interested in the traditional fields. So that's a tough thing too. But and to get back to a previous point of how colleges are going to get around this, I'm somewhat enjoying the dilemma that they face, because they're as obsessed with objective rankings of academic skills as anybody else. They purport not to be, but within each racial category, they race norm like crazy. So they rank Asians on their SAT scores, and they rank whites on their SAT scores, and they rank blacks and Hispanics on their SAT scores, and they want to get the best within that group. But if they continue using and accepting SAT scores, those will be smoking guns for the next Edward Blum lawsuit if it shows yet again, as I think it will, vast disparities in the average SATs that are an automatic reject if you're white and Asian, and virtually an automatic admit if you're Black or Hispanic. So the schools are going to have to decide, do they get rid of test scores completely and go blind in order to be able to cover up their tracks when it comes to the ongoing use of racial preferences, or do they keep them and then take the litigation risk that they'll be smoked out for their continuing preferences?
Yep. Yeah. If we're going to have racial quotas, it would actually be better to do what other civilized countries like India and Malaysia do and just be open about it.
Right.
I mean, the black SAT score that would get you into Harvard isn't bad. It was when last I looked at the Crimson's article, it was a 13 something. It was 100 plus points below the white and Asian SAT score. So if you're just going to say, okay, we'll take a black guy with a 1350, white guy needs a 1420, Asian guy needs a 1450. I mean, Harvard's obviously getting the best of students in each of these categories. Right. I have a problem with that, but it's not an existential, institutionally challenging problem. The idea that your entire system of admissions can be attacked at any time because it's just a gigantic scheme, I mean, that actually is. And that's a result, by the way, referring to some of the books that have been brought up in this conversation, that's a result of our, not weak, they're everywhere, but intangible civil rights laws, where we say things like no environment that can be found harassing by a reasonable woman of character can be allowed to exist. The question is, what does that mean? There's not like a set number of jokes or even a set litany of behaviors there. We allow coworkers and executives to sleep with each other. It's just that there's a point at which someone can sue you. What is it? Well, who knows? And that's what's kind of allowed the hegemony of HR, in my opinion. Like, they're the people that make the rules at the level of your house, your corporation.
Yeah. Well, people are terrified. There's just no question. Mm-hmm. And so the amount of self-censorship that goes on is unbelievable. I would say, I mean, in some of the rules may be a little more, you can predict what the outcome, like the disparate impact standard. Now, I don't know how much disparate impact it becomes illegal, but that, I guess, is maybe a little more clear that if you have a colorblind standard that asks for, say, a certain level of reading skill, and that has a disparate impact on underrepresented minorities, then it's a prima facie case of discrimination. So I think employers are sort of on notice for that. But yeah, the harassment thing, I mean, clearly we've just given license to females to take down males. It's a complete war on males. I wrote for Quillette recently about this absolute travesty that's going on in Spain of taking down the head of the Spanish Soccer Federation, who in a moment of absolute ebullient joy, elation, insane celebration, allegedly is a misogynist, that his female team won the World Cup in Australia against Britain. He gave the most fleeting of kisses to one of the players who had just lifted him up in a bear hug. And he's not only been hounded out of his job, he's got a criminal prosecution going against him for sexual harassment, and the judge just slapped a restraining order on him as if he's restraining. It's a travesty. But females are going around out of vengeance and spite and brittleness, destroying every male that they can.
Yeah, this is crazy. I wanted to go back a few minutes in time where we talked about admissions and these kinds of things. And, it's odd to me. Gene Simmons is more Asian than Lisa Ling. Lisa Ling is born in Sacramento. Gene Simmons was born in Haifa. These things, when you drill into them, they fall apart so quickly. Like someone who may be, my friend Dave, he's, I think, 5th generation American. but he's got Japanese and Hawaiian roots. So if you look at him, you think, oh, that guy's not from here. But he absolutely is from here. And so someone else doesn't get to determine when and where Dave is from. Dave's going to say, hey, I'm a multi-generational American. And if we just got away from some of that stuff, and what the heck does it even matter? Has Dave been Dave's a doctor. He's not impressed, and we have trouble sorting these things out for some reason. And it does get, when you get into the micro, it gets ridiculous. When some kid's hardworking and needs a break, there's breaks out there. But when we try to make macro breaks, it tends to break the system, and it doesn't seem to work. So that's just what I tend to notice when I see these things. Again, Gene Simmons and Lisa Ling. One's an Asian, one is not.
Well, you strike me as sort of an innocent, Pete.
Yeah.
It's the usual, well, why can't we all just get along? Or,
Yeah.
I don't see race when I see you.
I would like it to be that way,
I know you'd like it to be that way, but I think you're naive about the extent to which this thing is in control, and it has an entire industry behind it. It's a hustle. There is enormous power to playing a race victim card. And the weird thing, that what changed, there was already building in that direction, but after George Floyd, you really got this tsunami that took over the nation's elites to just make common cause with race activists against Western civilization. But I mean, to me, it's these arbitrary distinctions that you're puzzling over are not particularly surprising, given the value that is to be gained in playing the racial hierarchy game.
Yeah. Will?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, well, there are actually a couple different levels here. I mean, in terms of the idea of the basic concept that we can all just get along, well, the basic idea that a lot of these categories are just nonsensical and that most ordinary business class citizens would prefer to just get along. I mean, I'm not a particularly innocent person, but I would say that based on all data is probably true.
I think that's true.
Like, I actually don't think of Gene Simmons as Asian. I mean, when I think of Asians, I think of Easterners, I suppose.
I am being provocative. Yes.
Oh, no, I know. I mean, but like, I actually, like, one of my provocative ideas is that race pretty obviously exists. I mean, if you go into 23andMe, I mean, you can break down the human population into 7 or 8 different subgroups. And there are things that we haven't thought about in 50 years, like Malays. I mean, I took a DNA test and I'm exactly what I thought I'd be. I'm 40% Celtic, 40% Bantu, and 20% Plains Indian. I actually told my Indian friend's dad this, and he told me I was built for war, which is funny. It's probably my favorite description of any ethnic group, but it's like British, black, and like Comanche or whatever, like Dene.
Will you be in can I join your army or will you join mine, Will? I think you'd be a pretty good warrior. So
well,
I like
you, yeah. We'll definitely, I mean, we'll probably be teamed up if the collapse comes, actually. Okay, but I mean, yeah. So I think that sort of, just black, white, and Indian. I just put it in like some fancy academic terms like Bantu. But I mean, but the point, I just saw the comment. But I do think that point is correct. Now, the segue that I did there is I do think race exists. And I do think, like, when we say Asian, we mean Easterner in the West. Just if I were to say black, that means person of more than 50% Bantu or Nilotic extraction from Africa. Like, we do know what these words mean, even if we have to go back to the old forbidden books. But like, what Pete is illustrating actually is how silly some of these categories are. Because like Gene Simmons is a West Asian Caucasian is Asian. And under our current legal regime, maybe he might be MENA, which would technically be white. But the idea that you can put people in these defined categorical boxes, which don't really overlap with the actual race categories well at all, Hispanic, for example, and then you give people a guild interest in maintaining those categories. And there are activist, quote unquote, leaders that fight very aggressively for them. Right. I mean, I think that's been an extreme negative for society. And when citizens point that out, there is often an element of lack of understanding of how pervasive it is. But the basic idea is a good one. To get this down to one sentence, to really win from kind of a center right, we just want things to work perspective, you would have to get rid of that idea, which would mean getting rid of a lot of entrenched interest. And a question I would actually have for both of you guys is how would that happen? Like, how do you get rid of the whole NGO sector or the 2/3 of it that are focused on the race and class charities and so on?
Heather?
Well, I mean, for me, my concern right now is abolishing the disparate impact conceit and getting rid of the idea that any meritocratic or behavioral standard that has a disparate impact on, above all, blacks is per se racist. And because right now that's where their power is. If they can point to any institution that is not proportionally representative of every group in the country, then they have power to declare that institution per se racist and start imposing a whole set of remedies. So I think for me, and this kind of just defers the question because it raises the question, well, where are people going to get the courage to do this? It's going to require the courage to defend standards and say that standards are not the problem. Standards are not the problem. The solution is not to lower standards. The solution is to meet the standards. But right now, we obviously have a huge nonprofit NGO sector. I'm at the moment particularly focused on the one that is playing identity politics above all race, but also sex, and say that there are better explanations for disparate impact, which is the academic skills gap on the one hand and the behavior gap. So for me, it's a question of people willing to speak the truth and have the courage to do so and not be worried about being called a racist or a misogynist or sexist or you name it, and to be willing to stand up for colorblind and sex blind standards. But that's utopian. I mean, that's sort of, in one sense, that's putting off your question of, well, what really are the practical steps? And I don't know. I mean, short of individuals that are willing to stand up and take the fire, I don't know how you break the stranglehold that identity politics has on American society and our future progress.
Yeah, I mean that's a good if bleak summary, but coming from the law, I would say actually one option might be the Federalist Society model, where you frankly see that your political, if not future military, but I don't think it's going to happen, opponents control an entire sector of society, and you look at how they did it. I mean, like Breitbart, Chris Rufo, who's casual friend of both of ours, so on, have actually just analyzed this and said, well, this is how many people that went into each of these institutions during each of these 5-year cycles. And you kind of do the same thing. I mean, you send people to some law schools that will admit students based on quality, fair number in the upper Midwest, so on down the line, and you take the people from that result from that process, and you have to have some institutions ready to receive them, and you incubate them a little and you send them out in the wider world to compete. I mean, so I think that you're now seeing a number of leaders. Like, I'm not the most partisan guy, and I also think mainstream partisan politics is just kabuki. Watching Donald Trump come out as pro-choice and so on, it's entertaining. But I mean, but you're now seeing a number of political leaders like Ron DeSantis, frankly, saying that this needs to be done and starting to do it. I mean, Rufo is currently in charge of Florida's new college. So, I mean, I think we're going to have to brainstorm as this goes along. We're going to have to see how well the legal federalist model works in other sectors where you really want more of an idealistic approach from academics, I would say. But at some point, a big element of fighting wokeness or pseudo-Marxism or whatever in society is going to have to be tackling the NGOs, the university campuses, so on down the line, that have departments dedicated to this stuff. Mm-hmm. What do you do about that?
Yeah, and I would just say too, you're absolutely right to bring up Florida. I think DeSantis is just astounding in his willingness to just say, sorry, I'm not putting up with this any longer. And he's just showing that you can buck the trend as a politician. And, I have to say, I wasn't creative enough to think about that, but to actually say we're not funding colleges that have diversity oaths that are necessary to be considered for hiring or promotion, or we're not going to fund the DEI offices. Now, of course, those are chameleons and they're just renaming themselves. So that's going to be a sort of a cat and mouse game to try and smoke them out as they rebrand themselves as departments of belonging or whatever. But anyway, and we already have it's now DEIB generally, but still it is refreshing and I'm ashamed that I didn't see it coming, that you can have politicians who are willing to wield power in the opposite direction.
Yep.
And they'll be accused. I love it the way the left gets to set the default. The left is instantiating propositions that have never been imagined in millennia of human history, that sex is something assigned at birth rather than something that is present in every cell in a human being's body, in the chromosome count, that we can decide our gender, and that boys should be able to use female bathrooms, and that pediatric associations should be willingly going along with castrating children chemically or physically against the wishes of their parents. The left puts these ideas out, and then if the right fights back and says, we just want to go back to the status quo ante for the entirety of human history, it's the right that is accused of fighting a culture war. Are you kidding me? The left is on an absolute demolition crusade, but they just say, okay, like now we have gender affirming care, and third grade textbooks are going to have pictures of gay sex graphically. That's the norm. And if you want to get rid of books that are prematurely exposing children to knowledge of sexuality, I don't care if it's heterosexuality or homosexuality, that is wrong, and child abuse, that becomes the norm. And if you want to remove those books, you're the ones that are engaged in culture war and book banning.
Yeah, I mean,
Pete, go ahead.
Pete, you got a comment there?
Oh, no, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I mean, so I think one advantage here is that kind of the mainstream right position on a lot of these things has the advantage of being true. I'm sure the left felt the same way when they were campaigning for things that were real, like women have a higher verbal IQ than men, so should be able to open bank accounts. 1971. I mean, you bet Jane, who's fairly feminist, and like she'll remind me of some of this stuff sometimes when I look at, what the women's rights movement's doing today. But I mean, today, I think that the sort of lady and gentleman ideal that a lot of people on the right do take fairly seriously is in this a hindrance. But the corresponding advantage is that the things that are being argued for have been tried for 2,000 years and work. Right. So, I mean, on just as a very simple example, on social media, and this became like large in enough that I linked it to SurveyMonkey and actually downloaded the data. But I asked people, like, do you believe in a set of trans claims? Like one of them was some women have 9-inch penises, which Gad Saad said is a joke in his book, but a trans advocacy organization apparently took and made into a shirt. And I asked this, and it's like all my bro-y followers, a lot of guys who look like me and Pete, but it's also everyone's wife. I mean, all these business women who publicly say, like, yes, I believe. And so I expected about 30% of people would say, like, yeah, sure, I do. But it was 2%. Like 98% of people, totally anonymously, especially once we got the SurveyMonkey up there, just said, no, I don't believe that any women have penises. And the same business women that I had wondered about were commenting like, this is kind of offensive. It's stupid. The very idea that you can be a woman as a man is nonsense. It's good to be able to say that. So I think that with a lot of these questions, it really just takes someone stepping up. And like Ron DeSantis has just been openly mocking the left on the new college thing.
Yep.
Like he was accused of affirmative action for men because he wanted them to have a baseball team. And he was just sort of saying like, no, I think the state university should have a baseball team. Like the things you're saying are idiotic. Yeah. And when people hear that, I think the vast majority of them agree.
Yeah, interesting. Absolutely. As I say, the profile and courage, and it shows that these things can be done, and you'll be accused of waging the culture war, and the response is, so what? No, I'm not. You are the ones that are waging it. And now, as far as like we have the truth and they don't, I'm enough of a relativist that I have to know that they feel just as strongly in the opposite direction. And so, sure. I mean, I have to say, I'm both a relativist, and yet when I'm writing, I believe that I am putting forward the truth. So I have a completely contradictory, divided consciousness. But I sometimes think, and you were saying when you first got on, Wilfred, that, you find just all the political posturing ridiculous, and it's true. And, the Republicans are for executive orders when it's their guy in the White House that's issuing them, and then they're against them when it's the other guy in the office that's issuing them. So we do have a very sort of flexible set of standards. And so I don't know, I guess at some point it's just, one would hope that reason and truth matters, but it may be that ultimately what we're left with is just sheer political power. And you have to organize and put what you believe is the truth out there and hope enough people go along with you, and with the knowledge that other people will think that you're absolutely benighted. But your question also about getting rid of the NGOs, hermeneutics tells us that when you ask a question, you have an intuition about the answer. What is your answer for how you get rid of that whole parasitic nonprofit sector that is so important to the leftist project?
Yeah, for me, I mean, I think it's going to be kind of an intertwined virtuous cycle. Like, I think normal people that have platforms, including all three of us, need to just step up and not say, like, well, I have a slightly dissenting viewpoint, but just this stuff is nonsense. And I mean, I'm pretty relativist in the sense of, potentially amoral during business competition or something. But I mean, I do think that there are, like, once we establish the definitions of words, this is how I've debated postmodernists and usually won. Once you do that, it's very hard to make an argument for a POMO claim, which is why they're so reluctant to do that. But if I define a woman as an adult female human being, then no women have 9-inch penises. So, I mean, I think that there's a bunch of scrum every time you talk to these guys, and a frantic attempt to say that racism means being white and so on. But if you just hold to like the 1989 universally accepted definition of things, I don't really think they have a case on much. But I mean, so I think ordinary people need to step up and start saying that, like, not just, people disagree, but no, it's insane that a 6'4" dude raced against, my buddy Reilly Gaines and won the race, although by a millisecond. That's bizarre. Yeah. That sort of thing is, I think there's a huge audience for that. I think it's probably 75 to 95% of the country. Even when you're talking about things like crime or immigration, where people might have slight ethnic allegiances, like fewer African Americans want brutal police enforcement or hard police enforcement, fewer Hispanics want crackdowns at the border, but the percentage is still well over 50. And the country's 60% white. I mean, I think the large majority of people will just say, like, obviously, you'll have more beatings and rapes and so on, bluntly, if you take the police out of cities, and you can just show them the data and they'll see that. So people need to start talking. I think at the same time, leaders on the right and center need to establish alternative institutions. And we're starting to see that actually done with large scale things like fire entire colleges, so on down the line. But there needs to be a place for people who want to say these things to go, and also an entity that will defend those that do.
Right.
And I think that when you start so those would be my first 2 points. Like, I want to push people kind of in my lane toward not just being polite, but actually saying the truth. And I also think that when it comes to writing checks at the end of the year and so on, I and many other people are going to support some of these newer institutions that are saying the obvious and that are hiring people that do that. And I think as that happens, you're going to start seeing more of a groundswell that can remove some of these older organizations. Like, technically the Civil Rights Act protects, say, whites, men, so on. Like, once you get competent enough lawyers to do this without embarrassment, I think we're already there for this one, you can just start suing. I mean, the same thing, like lawfare, I think is going to be a big part of the successful war against gender ideology. Like, right now you're seeing people like Chloe Cole bring these cases like, yes, they removed my breasts and labia at 15. I mean, I hate to put it that way, but that's what happens. So, I can't imagine a typical jury of moms and dads not giving the kids that bring those cases tens of millions of dollars. And when that happens twice, I think you're going to see entire university health systems, that kind of thing, stop performing these surgeries. That's certainly going to be true in the public sector, where a governor or mayor or so on can tell you to a very large extent not to do this, or will remove $1 billion in tax benefits. But same thing with any of these institutions that are engaging in or supporting behavior that's technically illegal. I mean, departments of diversity hiring, for example, I mean, it's not implausible that a court case could remove 50% of them with one sweep. So I think you need to build up that groundswell where people tell the truth, people fund their own institutions, and then you need to aggressively attack the pre-existing institutions that are attacking you. And you'll find an enormous base of support for that. And like, I'm not even a huge advocate of the pro-life movement, but they did this for a while. There was this alternative subculture that no one noticed. The March for Life started drawing 3 or 4 million people per year. You have 3 conservative justices on the Supreme Court, and almost incidentally, they struck down Roe versus Wade. I mean, it wasn't even the biggest story of the year. It's just that's not the law anymore. And that's a side effect of power as versus a pure debate.
Right. I hear a lot of people also, with the litigation strategy, and that makes me a little nervous because I'm nervous about the future of our judiciary. Right now we're counting on judges where you can get a fair hearing, but I thought one of the most shocking scenes from the Brett Kavanaugh hearings was the Harvard and Yale law students out there chanting "Believe survivors," and that is a view that is absolutely inimical to the presumption of innocence and the due process of law. And a disproportionate number of those Harvard and Yale law graduates are going on the federal bench. And if they carry that assumption that plaintiffs, people accusing a guy of sexual assault, has an entitlement to belief, that is the end of justice. And so, we're all legal realists now, and we know that we already assume that the outcome of a case is going to be heavily influenced by a judge's politics. That's almost the first thing that's mentioned now in any article about Trump's legal problems or whatever, who appointed the judge. And that's a sad place to be in. But in any case, I think it's going to get a lot worse. So I'm not convinced that we can expect salvation from always having a fair hearing in the judiciary. You mentioned, we need entities to defend these people. That's absolutely right. In coming up with positive solutions for my book, I also suggested an entity that would be willing to go to bat whenever you have somebody like a Norman Wang, the electrocardiologist, physiologist at University of Pittsburgh Medical School, who wrote an article saying racial preferences in medical admissions are not working out. The students are experiencing big academic mismatches, as predictable. They're ending up at the bottom of the class. They're not landing residencies. We should go back to colorblind admissions. And Wang became an absolute pariah. He was taken off. He was no longer allowed to direct fellowships. He was banned from having contact with students. And what I think is you need to have an organization that will come to the defense of those few individuals that do have the courage to speak out against the disparate impact conceit with the data that explains why colorblind meritocratic standards do have disparate impact. It's not because of racism, it's because of the academic skills gaps. And it's not fair to seize on one word, Wilfred, that you just put out there in the stream of consciousness, but I feel compelled to take issue. And I know again that you were not specifically meaning this when you said that Blacks are less likely to support brutal law enforcement in their communities. I mean, I don't think anybody is defending brutal law enforcement, whether it's a question of maybe being proactive and being willing to use the constitutional power of stopping and questioning people. But anyway, I'm, to the extent that I wear a hat of supporting the police, I just wanted on the record that that's not the issue in the inner city. We used to have brutal police forces, certainly throughout the South into the civil rights era. The police were handmaidens of segregation, but that's not what's going on now. And I don't think anybody that wants a return to colorblind effective policing would ever support brutal law enforcement.
I mean, I totally respect that. I would personally support crucifying rapists and murderers. Like, I just don't care. And I actually think that under the surface is a very common attitude about like male professionals, like screw them, throw them in a fire. I mean, I understand obviously the police will not, advance this sort of terminology, probably not the best strategy. But I mean, in general, if you prefer the term effective, harsh, very focused, something like that, which I'm sure is more accurate. The numbers are slightly lower for African Americans. They're also not that much lower. I mean, the percentage of Blacks that want, I'd actually be interested in the percentage of like male businessmen and soldiers that would just support Bukele style cliffside prisons. And I would bet that it would be over 50%. I mean, so these are two different topics. The police today aren't particularly brutal, but the idea that we are supposed to have a great deal of sympathy for, say, a rapist, I really don't. I mean, if you're talking about actual demonstrated rape, child molesters and so on, I think most people would be totally fine with them hung in cages outside the city walls. So the whole idea that there is this pervasive post-Christian morality that we're supposed to apply to our enemies, like, I don't feel at all. And I don't think most people do. I think probably a gender divide. But I think, again, that's just something you're supposed to say politely. So every now and then the veil slips. But in terms of good quality policing, the figures are a bit lower for African Americans, but they're still around 80%. I have a profoundly positive conclusion, actually, to that piece of thought, which is that the idea that you can't build a civilized, diverse society is nonsense. Now, I mean, one thing you have to do is recognize the reality of diversity, which is that different groups tend to have advantages in different fields. The current situation where we're sort of supposed to pretend that African Americans and Asian Americans are equally good at every sport and across the range of mathematical tests, for whatever the reason for those gaps might be, is pretty silly. But the basic idea that your society can have high-performing Black and Asian members and go on for quite a long time, and we've already demonstrated that in the USA. And there are many other large, diverse countries, from India and Brazil today to the Roman Empire, one of humanity's greatest achievements, so on. So I think that if you simply present ideas that we might describe as conservative or rad centrist or something to the majority of people, Black, white, Hispanic, Asian, male, female, they're going to listen to them. I mean, I've found students at a solid historically Black college have no problem with them at all. So in terms of something like a campaign against crime, if you actually go into these neighborhoods and just say, we want crime eradicated, I think you'll pick up some voters. How many? That remains to be seen.
Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely true. The poll, I remember a Quinnipiac poll in New York that found that more Blacks voters in New York City wanted so-called broken windows policing, public order enforcement than whites, because they live with the consequences of disorder. So those polls are definitely out there. But I just come back to the same issue. The thing that needs to be taken down is the idea of disparate impact, that if you have, because right now law enforcement will have a disparate impact on Black criminals. It will, because the Black offending rate is so high, as is the Black victimization rate. Black juveniles after the George Floyd riots are now being shot at 100 times the rate of white juveniles. I mean, that's just a stunning disparity. Blacks between the ages of 10 and 24 die of gun homicide at 24 times the rate of whites of that same age cohort. And what I find so bizarre is if you're going to be a Black civil rights activist, and we're starting ab initio here, you have a choice. You can either be for Black criminals, or you can be for Black victims. And it was not foreordained that the Black Lives Matter activists would be for Black criminals, but that's what they are. They are trying to unwind criminal enforcement because it has a disparate impact on Black criminals. And the people that they're ignoring are the dozens of Black children who have been fatally gunned down in drive-by shootings since the George Floyd race riots. They never say their names. They don't say the names of Jocelyn Adams or Legend Taliaferro. Nobody gives a damn about these kids because they're Black, and the media is completely racist. They only care about white victims unless it's a Black who's been shot by a white person, which is extremely rare, or by a police officer, which is just as rare. So yes, I mean, I've spent many years going to inner city police community meetings and trying to give voice to those good law-abiding people there who are desperate for more police protection. But let's not be naive. There still are a lot of people out there profiting immensely from the race hustle.
Boy, that was a good long session of back and forth with you guys. I appreciate you guys doing that. Let's wrap things up. I guess, Will, let's give you last word for you, and then we'll come back to Heather and let her close out.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I mean, I think Heather and I agree on most of these topics. I will say one thing that I would kind of build on is that last comment. Like, if you were just born in an almost feral state or in the Rawlsian original position, and you came to the USA, your read on the country's issues would be totally different from what you hear, at least on the left, to some extent on the right as well, from television news readers and civil rights activists and so on down the line. And one of the reasons I know this is that that's kind of what happened in my case, which led to the writing I do now. Like, I grew up in the hood. I was born in like Chicago. I grew up, the nicest neighborhood I ever lived in was the east side of nearby Aurora. It's a city of about 300,000. And interestingly enough, I had the benefit of sort of an upper middle to upper class education. My mom was a former radical who was a school teacher. So, I mean, I was in the hood, but not of it in some like theoretical way. Like, but I'm still close to my friends today. And those two communities at this time, the late 1990s, I think were number 2 and number 5 nationally when it came to homicide rate. And going on into college, I remembered the actual problems that I had seen in those areas, and that to some extent I saw in the poor white trailer parks and so on that surrounded the sort of student ghetto part of Carbondale and this sort of place. And they seemed really obvious. Like, there were major issues with drugs. This is before opiates had gotten to their final peak. We're talking about the OOs right now, tens of thousands of deaths per year. Fatherlessness was clearly an epidemic problem for blacks and poor whites. Blacks, even more than poor whites, obviously had an issue with the gun. I mean, there was an incredible murder rate. Like, I lived in the murder capital. And when I took classes about social issues, no one ever discussed any of this. Poor whites weren't mentioned at all, by the way. But in the black community, the issue was always racism. And it seemed very theoretical. I mean, there had been plenty of Irish and Italian and Mexican kids where I lived in one of the country's biggest cities. So I started looking at how true a lot of these claims that we hear today were. And all of them seem to be just, thin bullshit. I mean, like, if you take, for example, when both of you have used that term disparate impact, all that means for the few listeners that might not know this is that when you take two groups and you look at their performance against a DV, against any metric, homicide rate, you see that there's a difference between them. Black Americans might be more likely, let's say, to be shot by the police than white Americans. But the next step would be adjusting for the crime rate in that community, or the police encounter rate, or anything else. And just as a senior at a state school, I knew how to do this. It's methods 301. Everyone knows how to do it. They're all lying. No one doesn't know how to do this. So, I mean, I guess that led to my perspective. Why are all these people lying about these very obvious things? And the answer is because we don't want to offend blacks or women or even poor whites, whatever the group might be. But then secondarily, what's the impact of that? It was always negative. And that's what leads to the idea of, why don't you just say what the truth actually is? So that's my conclusion. I think more people should do that.
Yeah.
Okay.
No, I agree. I mean, I have nothing to add to that. Absolutely. Disparate impact ignores that there are behavioral differences that lead to these different outcomes. The solution is to close the achievement gap. It's not to lower standards. The solution is to close the crime gap. It's not to get rid of law enforcement, which is what we've been doing since George Floyd, which is why we have cities that are now, places where it's very scary to be. So yes, we have to gain confidence in the legitimacy of meritocratic standards of achievement, of behavior, and not be terrified by being accused falsely of racism. And I agree that America, by and large, is, as I said before, is absolutely eager to be post-racial. And we just have to put the people that are making a massive good living out of extorting other people's money based on phony charges of racism out of business, and just get on with our business and start, again, building science, building medicine, saying that no, science matters, the qualifications of a scientist matters, not his race or sex. I do not care if a science research lab is an entirely female or entirely Asian or entirely black. I just want it to have the best cancer oncologist out there. So, it is time at long last for Americans to stop being frightened by the sex hustle and the race hustle.
I love it. Let me roll these credits.
Hey, thanks for watching the show. I really appreciate it. Right here, you can subscribe. Please do that. It makes the show grow. Hit that notification bell so you know which incredible guest is coming up next. Down below is the PayPal link. You can put a small subscription in. That is an enormous help. All that money goes right back into the show. And then right up over here are the next episodes you should listen to, curated by yours truly. Thank you